My name is Emma Carter, and I was 28 years old when my sister Rachel tried to drown me. One second I was standing in the bathroom, the next, my face was forced under the icy water of the tub. It hit me like glass, shattering across my skin. My lungs locked, my chest burned, and my body convulsed as water sliced into me. I thrashed, I clawed at the porcelain, my nails tearing, but her grip was unbreakable. She leaned close, her breath hot against my ear, whispering with hatred that cut deeper than the water. "You will never escape me. You will always be nothing." The words twisted inside me because I had heard them before, not just from her, but from my own mother, who once looked at me and said, "Stop being dramatic, Emma. You always make things up." The memory stabbed me as the water filled my throat. My heart pounded so violently I thought it would rip through my ribs. Spots of light burst across my vision. My body screamed for air, but Rachel only pushed harder. Her face twisted, eyes wide, lips curled into a sneer that did not belong to a sister. In that moment, she was not family. She was the executioner. My mind spun 1,000 memories, colliding years of gaslighting, years of being told I was invisible, years of silence. I thought this is how it ends, not in an accident, not in some faraway tragedy, but right here in the home that was supposed to protect me. Panic tore through me. Then something else surged, a flicker of rage, a spark of survival. My body arched upward with a force I did not know I had. Water exploded onto the floor, and I ripped one fractured breath into my burning chest. I coughed violently, choking each inhale like broken glass, but it was air, and I clung to it. Rachel's eyes blazed with fury. She lunged again, but I saw her now for what she was. Not the golden child my parents worshipped, but the monster who wanted me erased. And I whispered to myself through my raw throat, "I will not die like this." That night I survived her hands and her hatred, and now I will tell you how the truth finally came out in court, how the witnesses destroyed her mask, and how the courtroom shook when everything she tried to bury was dragged into the light. When I think back to my childhood, the first images are deceptively warm. A small suburban house with white shutters, Sunday dinners with the smell of roast chicken, my mother Diane humming while she folded laundry, my father Richard reading the newspaper in his favorite chair. I was Emma Carter, the younger daughter, quiet and often overlooked, while my older sister Rachel was bold, loud, radiant, the golden child in every way. At first, I believed that we were just different, but equal, that love could stretch far enough for both of us, and I clung to that belief like a lifeline. For a few early years, we played in the yard together, chasing fireflies, building forts out of blankets, laughing until the night swallowed us in safety. But slowly, the balance shifted. My mother's accident when I was 7 left her mood sharp and impatient, and in her frustration, she began to lean more heavily on Rachel, praising her constantly while turning her disappointment toward me. It started small, a shake of her head when I spilled juice, a sigh when I came home smudged with grass, and always the same refrain, "Why cannot you be more like your sister?" My father rarely interrupted his silence, becoming a verdict heavier than words. Rachel noticed the shift quickly. She discovered that she could do no wrong in their eyes, and she wielded that power like a weapon. If she wanted a toy, she took it. If she broke something, she blamed me. If she failed a test, she insisted I had refused to help her study. And every time my parents believed her. My protests were brushed aside as drama my tears labeled exaggeration. I remember one night when I was 10, burning with fever so high I could barely lift my head. I begged my mother to take me to the hospital, but she looked at me with tired irritation and said, "Rachel has her recital tonight. You will be fine. Just drink some water." She left me sweating on the couch while she and my father drove away proudly with Rachel, their golden child, shining under the stage lights, while I lay shaking in the dark. That was the night I realized I was not only invisible, I was disposable. The years pressed on and the divide widened. Rachel grew into her role as the favorite, collecting new clothes, tutors' birthday parties with balloons and music, while I inherited her worn dresses and was told to be grateful. When I earned ribbons for science fairs or perfect grades, the most I received was a distracted good job muttered over the noise of the television. My mother would beam with pride when Rachel stumbled through a dance routine, but when I stood proudly with a medal, my father barely looked up. The message was relentless. Rachel was special, I was expected. The pain sank into me like a stone, but beneath it something else grew, a stubborn refusal to disappear. I began saving money from babysitting from diner shifts, from tutoring younger kids, tucking each dollar into a jar under my bed. I dreamed of leaving, of building a life where I was not the shadow of my sister. That hope was fragile, but it carried me through sleepless nights. In high school, Rachel strutted down hallways with confidence, while I kept my head low, focusing on studies, working long hours, knowing education was my only escape. She mocked me for my seriousness, whispering in my ear, "They will never love you. You will always be nothing," and sometimes I almost believed her. But then I would think of the future I was crafting, and I clung to it, a tiny spark against the suffocating darkness. Still, the cycle continued. Rachel would demand my help with assignments, then laugh at me in front of her friends. She would break curfew and blame me, and when my parents scolded me for being irresponsible, I tasted the bitterness of injustice like bile. At dinner, she would dominate every conversation, her stories exaggerated, her laughter loud, while I sat silent, criticized for not being social enough. The gaslighting was constant. If I spoke up about her cruelty, my mother would frown and say, "Stop being dramatic, Emma. You always twist things," and my father would sigh as though my very existence was an inconvenience. The weight of that dismissal carved me into someone resilient but scarred. By the time I turned 16, I had stopped expecting fairness. I stopped sharing my victories. I stopped asking for praise. I built a shell around myself and poured everything into my grades and my savings. My dream of becoming a nurse grew clearer, not glamorous, but meaningful, a way to turn my own pain into compassion for others. That dream was my anchor, the one light I carried through endless years of neglect. Yet no matter how much I built inside myself, I could not escape the house. I still returned each night to the table where Rachel smirked at me, where my mother's criticism cut sharper than knives, where my father's silence confirmed that I would never measure up. The contradiction tore at me, the ache of longing for love from people who had none to give me the fragile hope that one day they might finally see me. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was the scapegoat and Rachel was untouchable. Even when I left for college, the shadow followed me. My parents praised Rachel for every small step she took, while my achievements were met with indifference. When I earned a scholarship, they did not attend the ceremony. Instead, they drove Rachel to a shopping trip. I stood on stage alone, smiling through tears, promising myself that I would never forget the feeling of being erased. In those years, I learned to survive by turning pain into fuel. Each dismissal was a push forward, each insult a reminder that I had to fight harder. Still, the scars ran deep, and the hope that my family might change clung stubbornly inside me. I returned for holidays, endured the cold glances, accepted the role of outsider. I told myself maybe one day they would value me. But the truth was growing clearer with each passing year. Rachel's cruelty was not a phase, it was a weapon sharpened by our parents' favoritism. And though I tried to ignore it to rise above it, that cruelty would one day boil over into violence that could no longer be hidden. Looking back, I see the pattern like a storm gathering on the horizon. I was the invisible one, the resilient one, but even resilience has a breaking point. The flashbacks I carry are not just memories, they are the soil that fed the night Rachel tried to drown me, the proof that her hands were only the final act of a play that had been rehearsed my entire life. By the time I entered my teenage years, the roles inside our home had already solidified like iron. Rachel was the radiant star, the daughter who could do no wrong, and I was the shadow pressed into silence. At first, I believed that if I worked hard enough, if I collected enough achievements, maybe the balance would shift. I poured myself into school every grade, a quiet rebellion, every late-night study session, a small declaration that I mattered. Yet each success was met with silence at home, or worse, twisted into fuel for Rachel's cruelty. She mocked me for staying up late, called me a nerd, told her friends that I had no life, and when I tried to protest, she would lean in close and whisper the words that carved scars deeper than any bruise. "They will never love you, Emma. You will always be nothing." The words echoed through me long after she left the room, until even in my victories, I felt hollow. Still, there were glimmers of hope. A teacher praised my essays, a diner customer slipped me a larger tip after a long shift, a neighbor told me I had a kind heart. These small sparks reminded me that the world outside our house was bigger, that maybe beyond those walls I could become more than a scapegoat. I held on to that hope desperately, but each time I returned home, Rachel's shadow fell across me again. She discovered new ways to control me, new games to play with my parents as her audience. If she wanted my savings, she demanded it, and when I refused, she accused me of being selfish. My mother would frown, my father would sigh, and once again, I was the villain. If she skipped her chores, she blamed me, and they believed her. If she stayed out late, she claimed I had distracted her, and I was the one scolded. The injustice pressed down on me like a weight, and the gaslighting twisted my own thoughts until I questioned whether I was the problem. I remember sitting on my bed, staring at my hands, wondering if maybe I was the selfish one. Maybe I was too dramatic. Maybe I really was unlovable. That despair was the lowest valley of my young life. And yet, even there, a seed of defiance survived. I told myself quietly that I would not live this way forever. I kept saving money from diner shifts, kept studying with relentless focus, building brick by brick an invisible escape route. Still, Rachel did not let me go. The more independent I became, the harsher she grew. She rifled through my things, mocked me in front of relatives, laughed at the calluses on my hands from work. When I bought secondhand textbooks with my own money, she sneered and said, "You are wasting your life, Emma." The cruelty was constant, and my parents watched in silence. Once at dinner, Rachel accused me of stealing from her wallet. I froze, stunned by the lie, and my father looked at me with disappointment so sharp it felt like a knife. I tried to defend myself, but my mother cut me off with a sigh. "Emma, stop being so defensive. Just admit what you did." My throat burned with words unsaid, and in that moment I realized that in their eyes I was guilty before I ever spoke. I swallowed the pain and stared at my plate, my appetite gone, my soul trembling. That night, I worked a double shift at the diner, the ache in my feet mixing with the ache in my chest, but when I tucked a few more dollars into my jar, I felt a flicker of strength. Even if they did not see me, I saw myself. Even if they dismissed me, I was building something real. That was the rhythm of my adolescence pain crashing against me, tiny hopes sparking in the dark, then pain surging back stronger. Each cycle carved resilience into me, but also wore me thin. I longed for kindness, and sometimes I found it in unexpected places. A librarian who recommended books, a customer who asked about my college plans, a classmate who said I was the smartest person she knew. Those moments were fragile lifelines, but Rachel knew how to pull them away. She humiliated me at school by spreading rumors, she intercepted calls from friends, she told teachers that I had cheated. Even when evidence proved otherwise, the damage lingered. The pressure built year after year like steam trapped inside a sealed pot. By the time I graduated high school, I was exhausted but determined. I had earned a scholarship I had saved enough for textbooks, and I told myself that once I stepped onto a college campus, I would finally be free. For a short while, that hope tasted real. On campus, I was praised for my dedication, professors noticed my work ethic, classmates admired my focus. I worked night shifts as a caregiver, studied until dawn, and though I was bone-tired, I felt alive. I thought perhaps the past was finally behind me, but Rachel did not fade. Each time I returned home, she sharpened her knives. She demanded money, she mocked my independence. She told my parents I was arrogant. My mother accused me of abandoning the family. My father said nothing, but his silence was heavier than words. I wanted to believe I could ignore them, but the house was a trap. One holiday dinner, Rachel leaned across the table and hissed, "You think you are stronger now, but you will regret this." The words slithered into me like poison, reviving every old wound. I tried to dismiss them. I tried to cling to my dream, but dread gnawed at me. The cycle had escalated from whispers to insults to lies, and now her rage had grown too large to be contained by words. I saw it in her eyes, a storm gathering, and deep down I feared that one day the violence would spill from her tongue into her hands. I told myself I was prepared, that I was strong enough, that I had survived worse. But strength can only carry you so far when the enemy lives under your roof and wears the face of your own sister. The night it finally happened did not begin with thunder or screaming, but with an unsettling silence that clung to the walls of our house like smoke. I had come home from college for a short weekend, carrying my textbooks and the exhaustion of endless shifts at the hospital. My hope was foolish that maybe for just a few hours I could sit in my childhood room and breathe without conflict. Rachel was already there, sprawled in her old chair as though she still owned every corner of the home. Her eyes followed me with a sharpness that made my stomach tighten. She asked about my savings, about my job, her voice sweet but her meaning sharp. I answered carefully, knowing that honesty would only spark her anger. When I said my money was for tuition, she sneered and whispered, "You are selfish, Emma. You never cared about this family." My mother nodded in agreement. My father sighed, and the air grew heavy with judgment. I excused myself and climbed the stairs, telling myself I would endure one more night. That fragile hope lasted only a few hours. Past midnight, the door to my room slammed open so violently that the frame rattled. Rachel stood there, hair disheveled, face red with fury, and before I could speak, she yanked the cord from the lamp and advanced. Her eyes were wild, her breathing ragged, and I knew before she touched me that she intended to hurt me. She lunged, wrapping the cord around my throat with terrifying force, pulling it tight until the world spun into a blur. My nails scraped against her wrists, my lungs clawed for air, but the cord bit deeper, carving fire into my skin. She hissed, "You think you can humiliate me, you think you can live without me, but you will see what happens when you say no." The words blurred into the pounding of my heartbeat, into the roar of blood in my ears. My body thrashed violently, but she only pressed harder, her knee slamming into my ribs until I felt a sharp crack that exploded pain through my chest. I gasped a wheeze, lost in the airless room, and for a moment I believed this was the end. Memories crashed into me, the fever night when my mother left me the recital, where I was forgotten, the endless dinners where silence condemned me. I thought, this is how I die, not at the hands of a stranger, but of the sister who had been sharpened into my executioner by years of favoritism. The despair was suffocating, but then instinct surged, a tiny thread of survival sparking in the darkness. I slammed us both backward into the wall, the impact rattling the lamp and loosening the cord, just enough for one jagged breath to cut through my chest. I coughed, choking my vision swimming, but it was air and I clung to it. Rachel screamed, her voice unhinged, "You are nothing, Emma, nothing!" and lunged again. My arm flung wildly, striking the lamp, and glass shattered across the floor. The noise tore through the silence, and for a moment even she froze. My body trembled, ribs screaming with each inhale, but I staggered toward the desk, one hand clutching my bruised neck. I wanted to cry for help, but only a rasp escaped, raw and broken. I thought perhaps this noise would save me. Perhaps someone would come, and that hope flickered like a fragile flame. But then Rachel shifted, crocodile tears filling her eyes, her hand striking her own arm to raise marks, her sobs echoing as footsteps approached. My parents burst in their eyes, going first to Rachel, weeping on the floor, then to me, gasping for air, the cord coiled beside me like a snake. I tried to speak, but my voice was shredded, my throat raw. Rachel wailed. She attacked me first. I had to defend myself, and my mother rushed to her side, whispering my poor baby, while my father glared at me with cold disappointment. The betrayal was heavier than the cord itself. Even faced with the marks on my neck, even with glass glittering across the carpet, they chose her. The room tilted with dizziness, my ribs ached with every breath, and tears blurred my vision. I wanted to scream, to beg them to see me, but I knew from the hard set of their faces that they never would. I stumbled backward out of the room, clutching the wall for balance, my body broken, but my spirit trembling with a new clarity. This was not just cruelty, not just favoritism. This was attempted murder, and they had chosen once again to look away. The despair nearly swallowed me, but beneath it, a new strength began to pulse. If they would not see me, then others would. If my voice could not reach them, then evidence would. That night in the hospital, as X-rays revealed the fractures in my ribs as bruises bloomed dark across my skin, I realized that Rachel had gone too far to hide. My parents could scream lies, they could call me dramatic, they could pretend I was unstable, but the proof was now carved into my body, undeniable and permanent. That thought gave me a fragile sense of hope, a whisper that maybe justice would finally come. Yet the fear still lingered, the memory of water and cords and choking darkness replaying in my mind like a cruel film. I lay on the hospital bed, trembling, wondering if courage would fail me, if silence would return. But then a nurse touched my hand gently and said this was not an accident. "Emma, you do not need to carry this alone." The words settled into me like warmth after endless cold, and I realized that survival was only the beginning. I would have to fight again, but this time not in silence, this time not alone. The hospital room was cold and sterile, the air filled with the faint scent of antiseptic and the steady beeping of machines. Yet for me, it felt like the first sanctuary I had known in years because Rachel was not there, and neither were the walls that had hidden her cruelty. I lay on the bed with bruises swelling dark across my neck and chest, my ribs aching with every breath, my voice reduced to a rasp that scraped my throat raw. Fear still clung to me like a second skin, the memory of her hands and the cord replaying over and over, each replay threatening to crush the fragile sense of survival that had carried me out of that house. The despair pressed down heavy, but then came a shift so small it might have been overlooked if not for how desperately I needed it. A nurse adjusted my blanket and paused when her eyes traced the marks circling my throat. She glanced at the doctor and then looked back at me with quiet certainty and said, "This was not an accident, Emma. You do not have to carry this alone." Those words cut through years of silence like a blade through fog. No one in my family had ever acknowledged the truth. No one had ever believed me, but here in this room, a stranger did. Hope flickered fragile and trembling, but alive. The doctor followed with questions, his tone calm but firm. He asked me if I wanted to explain if I felt safe at home. My mouth went dry, fear choking me more tightly than the cord had, and I shook my head weakly. For a moment, despair surged again, telling me I was still trapped, still voiceless, but then he leaned closer and said, "I have seen injuries like this before. I have a duty to report what I see." The words thundered through me. It was not up to my parents anymore, not up to Rachel, not even up to my broken voice. The truth was visible in my bruises, in my fractures, in the swelling that no lie could erase. The pain of that realization was sharp, but so was the relief. For the first time, the evidence would speak louder than the gaslighting. When the police officer arrived later that evening, I trembled uncontrollably, terrified that somehow Rachel would twist this too, that my parents would convince him I was unstable. I could hear their voices outside the door, pleading with the nurse to release me early, insisting it was a family misunderstanding. The fear surged again, pulling me back into the pit of helplessness. But then the officer entered, clipboard in hand, gaze steady, and he asked me simply, "Do you feel safe at home?" Tears welled in my eyes. I nodded once and then shook my head violently, and that contradiction was enough. He saw me, he understood, he wrote it down. Hope surged again, faint but undeniable. For once, my body told the truth, even when my voice could not. The nurse confirmed her observations. The doctor provided X-rays, showing the broken ribs. The officer documented everything. My parents grew louder in the hallway, my mother shouting that I was destroying the family, my father calling me ungrateful, but their words no longer drowned me. For the first time in years, their gaslighting fell short. The truth had been pulled from the shadows into official reports. That night, I lay under thin hospital sheets, trembling with both fear and relief. I was still terrified of what Rachel would do, still haunted by the memory of water filling my lungs. but I also felt the fragile weight of allies pressing around me. The nurse who believed me, the doctor who refused to ignore the officer who wrote down my pain as fact. They were small lights, but together they pierced through the darkness. For the next days, the world began to shift. A social worker visited her folder thick with forms, her voice calm and patient. She asked if I wanted to press charges, if I had somewhere safe to stay, if I understood that this was abuse and that I had choices. The questions terrified me because each answer meant exposing more, stepping further into the storm. But each also offered a step toward freedom. I signed slowly, my hand shaking, my ribs throbbing, but inside me something rebuilt. Every signature was a declaration that I was not invisible. Still, the shadows fought back. Rachel's lies traveled fast. She told relatives that I had gone crazy, that she was the victim, that she had no choice. My parents called me again and again, leaving voicemails dripping with rage. My father snarled, "You are destroying us, Emma." My mother hissed, "You will regret this when your sister rots in jail." The despair pressed against me. Guilt gnawed at my chest. But then I remembered the nurse's words and the officer's question, and I forced myself to breathe through the pain. The cycle was trying to pull me back, but the turning point had already come. The truth was recorded, the evidence undeniable. When I was discharged, the fear returned, the thought of Rachel waiting, the image of her sneer haunting me. But arrangements had been made. I stayed with a family friend, surrounded by people who offered quiet support. At night, I still woke drenched in sweat, the sound of water crashing through my dreams, but each morning I opened my eyes to safety. Slowly, the balance began to tilt. The small hope grew stronger, the despair weaker, though it never disappeared entirely. That is the nature of survival. Pain resurfaces, doubt creeps back. But each wave carries less weight when you have proof that the tide can turn. Looking back, that hospital stay was the line in the sand. Before it, I was alone, silenced, erased. After it, I was seen, documented, believed. The fear did not vanish, but a foundation was laid for the fight that would come. The turning point was not loud or dramatic, it was quiet. Voices, steady hands, written reports, all combining to shift the story out of Rachel's control. And as I lay awake in the dark, listening to the rhythm of my own heartbeat, I whispered to myself that maybe, just maybe, justice was possible. The day of the hearing arrived with a chill that sank into my bones long before I stepped into the courthouse. The walls inside were pale and humming with the low sound of an air conditioner, but the tension made the air feel heavier than any summer heat. I sat beside my lawyer, clutching the folder that held the x-rays and medical reports, my ribs still aching, though weeks had passed, my throat still rough from the bruises. Across the room sat Rachel. Her hair neatly brushed her face, painted with sweetness, the same mask she had used for years to convince the world she was innocent. She smirked briefly, as if the outcome was already written in her favor, as if the old rules of our family still applied here. My parents sat behind her eyes, fixed on her back, refusing to look at me, their loyalty radiating like a blade. The pain of that betrayal pressed hard, but layered over it was a fragile strand of hope. This was not our dining table. This was a court of law, and here evidence mattered. The proceeding began with formality, the judge calm but watchful, the attorneys laying out their narratives. At first, it sounded like any domestic dispute, the kind that courts had heard countless times, and fear crept back into my chest. I imagined Rachel charming them all. I imagined my parents' voices swaying sympathy, and for a moment despair gnawed at me again. Then my lawyer rose with steady hands and placed the x-rays on the display board. One by one, the images glowed under the courtroom lights. The fracture lines in my ribs, the bruising patterns around my throat, the evidence carved into bone and flesh. The silence that followed was absolute. The judge leaned forward, studying closely, and then looked directly at Rachel. For the first time, her composure cracked. Her hands trembled slightly. Her lips tightened, her smirk faltered. She whispered something to her lawyer, her shoulders hunching as if the weight of her lies had suddenly become too much. My parents shifted uneasily. My mother shaking her head as though wishing the images away, my father's jaw clenching until his knuckles whitened. They had built their world on denial, but the evidence was undeniable. A neighbor testified next Mrs. Henderson, her voice steady as she described hearing the struggle. The crash of glass, my choked cries. The EMT described my condition on arrival. The doctor confirmed that the injuries were consistent with strangulation. Each voice layered on the truth until the narrative that Rachel had spun collapsed piece by piece. The courtroom murmured whispers rippling through the benches, gasps escaping as the weight of the evidence settled. Rachel's tears spilled freely now, no longer calculated but desperate, her face blotched with shame. Watching her break did not bring the triumph I had once imagined. It brought grief for the years I had lost, for the scars etched into me, but also a release, a shift of power I had never thought possible. When the judge spoke again, his tone carried authority that sliced through every doubt. He acknowledged the evidence, the testimonies, and ruled Rachel guilty of assault with intent to cause bodily harm. The words echoed inside me like a bell, heavy and final. The sentence was not extreme community service restitution for medical bills, mandatory counseling, but to me it was monumental. For once, she was held accountable. For once, the truth was recognized by someone who could not be swayed by tears or favoritism. I looked at my parents, searching for even a flicker of realization, but my mother's glare burned with anger. My father's eyes were cold with disappointment. They still chose her. That pain flared again, sharp and raw, but beneath it, something else grew stronger. I did not need their validation anymore. I had the validation of the court of evidence of truth. As Rachel was let out, her posture slumped, her eyes swollen from crying, the mask shattered. People whispered, some stared, others looked away in discomfort. For once, I was not the liar, not the troublemaker, not the dramatic child. I was the victim who had survived and spoken, and my voice had been heard. That realization steadied me each breath, painful but filled with a quiet triumph. In the days that followed, the story spread. Local news reported on the assault, the neighbors whispered, former teachers reached out with words of support. Strangers wrote letters saying I was brave. For years, my parents had warned me that speaking up would leave me isolated, abandoned, but the opposite was happening. The more the truth spread, the more allies I gained. Yet the backlash from my family did not fade. My mother left messages accusing me of destroying their reputation. My father told me I would regret choosing outsiders over blood. Their words stung, but they no longer defined me. The court had spoken louder. Each message they sent reminded me only of why I had fought. The cycle of pain still pulsed, nightmares of drowning still ripped me awake. Shame still whispered that maybe I had gone too far, but each time I returned to the image of those X-rays glowing under the lights, undeniable proof that I had not imagined it, undeniable proof that I had survived real violence. That memory rebuilt me each time despair tried to pull me back down. Justice was not perfect, but it was enough to carve out space for healing. For the first time, I felt the ground solid beneath me, not shifting with the moods of my sister or the silence of my parents, but steady with the recognition of truth. In that steadiness, I found the strength to move forward step by trembling step into a life that belonged to me. The weeks after the court ruling were not filled with sudden peace, they were filled with silence that carried both relief and loneliness. At night, I often woke drenched in sweat, my chest aching with the memory of broken ribs, my throat burning with the ghost of Rachel's grip. The nightmares dragged me back to the water again and again, the panic flooding me until I sat upright, gasping, terrified that somehow I was still trapped. The pain was real, and it did not vanish with the verdict. Yet amid the fear, small sparks of hope began to appear. I started therapy with a counselor who listened without judgment, who reminded me that the trembling in my hands and the racing of my heart were not weakness, but trauma echoing through my body. Each session was difficult, tears flowing as memories clawed their way out of me, but each time I left with a little more space to breathe. The counselor encouraged me to join a support group, and though I hesitated, afraid of being seen as broken, I eventually walked into a circle of strangers who carried stories so hauntingly similar to mine that I felt less alone. We shared scars both visible and invisible, and in that circle my voice grew stronger. The cycle of pain still returned. Some days I could not get out of bed shame, whispering that maybe my parents had been right. Maybe I was the problem. On those days I stared at the ceiling and felt the weight pressing down. But then I would remember the faces of those who believed me, the nurse, the doctor, the officer, the judge. Their belief rebuilt me piece by piece. Slowly, I began to carve out a life separate from my family. I moved into a small apartment across town, the smell of fresh paint greeting me as I carried in a single box of belongings. It was not much, but it was mine, a space no one could invade. The first thing I bought was a small green plant, and each morning I watered it, watching it lean toward the sunlight, fragile but persistent, a reflection of myself. I returned to my nursing program with renewed determination. Caring for patients reminded me why I had chosen this path, because I knew what it felt like to be ignored, to be dismissed, and I swore I would never let anyone else feel invisible in my presence. Each thank you from a patient, each nod from a professor stitched together the pieces of my worth. Still, the shadows lingered. My parents refused to accept the truth, sending messages filled with blame clinging to Rachel even as the community turned away from her. Hearing their voices reopened wounds, but each time I reminded myself that their denial was not my burden to carry anymore. I was building something new, and they could not take that from me. Months passed, and though the nightmares did not vanish, they lost their edge. The panic still came, but now I had tools to steady my breath. I surrounded myself with people who valued me. Friends who celebrated my victories, mentors who guided me, and slowly the house of lies I had grown up in became only a memory instead of a prison. Healing was not a straight line. It was a series of waves, pain rising, then receding, hope sparking, then faltering, but always rebuilding stronger. One evening, I was invited to speak at a community event about domestic violence. My hands trembled as I took the microphone, the crowd blurring into a sea of faces. But once I began to speak, the words poured out. I told them about the years of silence, the night of violence, the courtroom where truth finally shattered denial. The room was silent as I finished, then applause rose. Not the shallow applause of obligation, but the deep resonance of people who understood. Tears slid down my cheeks as I realized my story was no longer only about pain, it was about survival and the strength to rebuild. That night under the cool sky, I looked up at the stars and felt a peace I had not known since childhood. I was scarred, but I was not broken. I was a survivor, and I was enough. The morning after everything was finalized in court, I woke to a silence that was no longer filled with fear, but with freedom. For years, silence in my family's house had meant tension, the waiting for the next storm, the dread of Rachel's footsteps, the weight of my parents' judgment. Now the silence in my small apartment was gentle, a reminder that no one could barge in, no one could drag me into lies, no one could strip me of breath. I stood before the mirror, still carrying the bruises and scars, still waking from nightmares, but I saw someone different staring back. She was not the broken girl, begging to be believed she was a woman who had faced cruelty and lived to tell it. The pain was still inside me, the grief for the love I never received, the ache of knowing my parents would never stand beside me, and some nights that grief pressed hard, whispering that I was alone. Yet the truth shone louder. I had survived. I had spoken. I had been heard. Hope was no longer a fragile spark. It was a steady flame guiding me forward. In the months that followed, I built routines that anchored me. I studied, I worked, I nurtured friendships that reminded me of my worth. I tended to the little plant in my apartment, watching it grow taller, a living symbol that healing takes time but is always possible. The memories of Rachel's attack still returned sometimes when I stood too close to running water, or when a sudden noise startled me and the fear surged like an old ghost. But each time I steadied myself with the truth. I was not drowning anymore. I was free. The past would always be part of me, but it no longer owned me. I began to share my story more often, not because I enjoyed revisiting the pain, but because I understood what it meant to someone sitting in silence thinking they were alone. Each time I spoke, a little of the shame lifted. Each time someone thanked me for giving words to their own hidden wounds, I felt a piece of my own heart mend. My story had been built from pain, but it had grown into a testament of survival. To anyone who has felt trapped in the prison of family, lies, to anyone who has been silenced by fear or dismissed by those meant to protect them, know this: you are not alone and you are not weak. The truth may be heavy, but once spoken, it cannot be buried again. Justice is possible and healing is real. If my journey has shown you even a glimpse of hope, hold on to it, because hope is the beginning of freedom. Share this story so others can find their voice. Leave a comment if you have lived through your own silence, and subscribe if you believe more stories like this deserve to be heard. Together we can break the cycles that thrive in darkness and replace them with the light of truth.